For today's episode of Luxury versus Mainstream, we have two of the best electric vehicles on sale in America today. Over here in white, we have the all-new Genesis GV60, and over here in blue, we have the recently released Kia EV6. These two are very closely related cousins, and there is a third in the family. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 is a close cousin to both of these, although depending on how you want to look at it, these two are perhaps a little bit more closely related than the Ioniq 5 to the Genesis GV60. Now, obviously, the first difference between these two vehicles is going to be the logo on the hood. Genesis is a luxury brand. They're going after Lexus, after Mercedes-Benz, Audi, etc. Kia over here, they're a mainstream brand, and they're a mainstream brand with kind of a spotted history. 30 years ago, Kias were truly terrible. Over the last 10 years, Kias have been exceptional, but their brand reputation has not caught up. So if you're really concerned about the logo on the hood of your vehicle, you're probably going to want the Genesis. I'll apologize if it's difficult to see some of the details on either of these vehicles. Rather unfortunately, cameras don't do well when we're trying to film a really dark car with a really light car. But when you first approach these vehicles, you'll notice that they definitely have different schools of design, even though at some angles they do look pretty similar. The Kia has a slightly longer hood profile because it really dramatically slopes down there towards that pinched-in front end. It's really trying to go for a very sleek, very modern look. The Genesis over here, they tried to wrap some of the Genesis design cues onto the eGMP platform, but they also decided they didn't want all their vehicles to look like Russian nesting dolls. So we have the stacked headlight arrangement where this body color strip bisects that headlamp module, and then sort of an homage to the same sort of grille that we find in the rest of the Genesis lineup down there, but no Superman shield other than maybe this little triangle right there. As you'd expect, both models have full LED headlights and full LED turn signals as well. I think the ones in the Genesis are more elegantly done, and these headlights are certainly superior to the Kia's headlights at night. So part of what you're paying for is better headlight technology. These are projector headlight modules. Over here we have reflector headlight modules in the Kia, which are a little bit less expensive, but these also put out more light, and the light pattern is definitely more pleasing at night. I'm a little bit disappointed long-term in the headlights that we find in the Kia EV6. Under the hood, the two vehicles are very similar. This platform was designed from the ground up to be an electric vehicle, but not to have a front trunk. Instead, we have a fairly small storage compartment right here in both vehicles. It's essentially the same, although we have a Genesis logo over here and then just an EV logo over here in the Kia. But if we open them up, about the same kind of storage volume here. I have my vehicle to load connector in this one, Tesla tap, California Duster. You could probably also put your temporary charge cord in there if you wanted to, but other than that, pretty much the same under the hood. It may not be immediately obvious, but the GV60 is the smaller of these two vehicles. It's about 7 inches shorter than the EV6. Some of that happens up front. You'll notice the slightly longer hood profile over here in the EV6, but a lot of it happens right back here in the rear, and that's why the cargo area is smaller in the GV60, and it has a bit more of a, I guess, Porsche 911 meets crossover look with this large spoiler right here on the rear. Also, a little bit more of a traditional upright crossover form factor than the EV6, which is a really reclined vehicle. The wheelbase is exactly the same between these two vehicles, 114.2 inches, which is a little bit shorter than the wheelbase we find in the other close cousin, the Ioniq 5. Now, the mission of these two vehicles is quite different. The EV6, it was designed to compete with the likes of the Mustang Mach-E, the ID4, the BZ4X, the Solterra, etc., all of those mainstream vehicles. And this will start significantly less expensive than the Genesis. The EV6 theoretically will start right around $40,000 or so, although this model is about $60,000, about 10 grand less than this Genesis over here. The Genesis, on the other hand, is sort of a subcompact crossover, sort of somewhere between subcompact and compact in the luxury segment. The closest direct competitors to this would be the Volvo C40 and the Volvo XC40 at the moment, because they're available in the United States and they're full electric. Coming soon, we're going to find some BMW, some Mercedes, and some Audi small crossovers, although this seems to be a little bit smaller than the new Q4 e-tron. Maybe at some point we'll get a Q3 e-tron. That would be the more direct corollary to the GV60. If you're confused by that, keep in mind that there is also a GV70 electric. The GV70 is the one that competes with the X3, the Volvo XC60, that next category up. There's going to be an electric version of that, so that's going to be the one that's going to compete with those larger electric vehicles like the Q4 e-tron, not the GV60. The sportier demeanor of the EV6 is really accentuated by this particular design cue in the rear, where we have this very wide flared hip shape there. really tucked in greenhouse. That compromises the rear passenger area. It really is kind of tight in the head area there and the shoulder area, but it really gives it this dramatic and expressive look. Also kind of cool, there are accent lights right here under this big wing to kind of illuminate that hip at night and really further accentuate that design. But it does mean that in terms of interior practicality, the Ioniq 5 is going to be the most practical of the trio. Moving over to the Genesis, we still have a bit of that wide hip profile, but it's less accentuated than in the EV6. The design is perhaps a little bit more traditional as well, and a little bit more in keeping with the rest of the Genesis lineup with this tail lamp module that's split just like the headlights. We have this big wing in the back, which kind of gives me a bit of a Porsche vibe. It is actually splitting between two window sections. So there's actually a piece of glass right there under the wing and then a piece of glass above the wing. And when you're looking through the rearview mirror, you're looking through both of them. From a business standpoint, I've always been fascinated by the way that the Hyundai Motor Corporation has organized its three car brands: Kia, Hyundai, and Genesis. In South Korea, they are more conjoined than they are in the United States. And in the United States, Hyundai and Kia are absolutely separate. They share no employees, no marketing agencies, no PR departments, etc. Genesis is semi-tied with Hyundai in the United States, but it is technically a separate registered IRS corporation as well. The way that these three vehicle brands, I guess you could say, handle product development is also pretty unique because it's not like anything we've seen in the US before. It absolutely is not the process that we see with Ford, with General Motors, or with the Chrysler group of companies. But it's not quite totally separate companies either. Essentially, although not directly, what's going on is that Hyundai Motor Corporation in Korea, or I guess you'd say the Hyundai umbrella brand probably more directly, they develop vehicle platforms like the eGMP platform that underpins both of these vehicles. They design the motors, the battery control systems, common communication systems, infotainment systems, LCD units, etc. Then each brand, when designing their respective vehicle, gets to pull from this communal parts bin and choose to use it or not, or choose to use extra features or not. So this Genesis vehicle and the Kia are undoubtedly related, and they share motor units and control systems, but the interiors are unique. They share absolutely no sheet metal. They don't share any glass. The dimensions are definitely different in the vehicles as well. And then on the inside of the Genesis, we also have unique switches and buttons and gadgets and gizmos in order to make it look more luxurious and more unique. But the core architecture is roughly similar. They use the same electric motor in the back. In this vehicle, it's rated for 214 horsepower. Over here in the EV6, it's slightly higher, and that just appears to be some metric to English conversion, and perhaps just the way that they have programmed the software. They also use essentially the same front electric motor. It's just under 100 horsepower in both vehicles, giving this a rated horsepower of 314, and the Kia and the Hyundai a rated horsepower of 320 combined, thanks to a 77.4 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack. Now, I don't know exactly which battery pack the Genesis uses, but I do know that the Kia and the Hyundai, they actually use different cell manufacturers for the cells, but the battery packs themselves are interchangeable. And that was to give them more manufacturing flexibility and the ability, say, if there was a problem with one battery manufacturer, for everybody to jump on board with the other one. That's likely what's going on with the Genesis as well. The big difference is that that's where the Genesis starts. Currently, the EV6 ends at 320 horsepower. This starts at 314 horsepower, goes up to 483 horsepower. That's the performance model I'm taking a look at today. Essentially, what Genesis did was they took the electric motor that's in the rear of both of these and they jammed one up front as well. That takes power up from 314 horsepower to 429 horsepower, or if you hit the boost button, all the way up to 483 horsepower. Now, if you want even more pep, there is going to be an EV6 GT a little bit later this year with nearly 600 horsepower. So as you can see, lots of modularity with these components, and I would not be surprised if there was an even more powerful version of the GV60 at some point in the future. Range is definitely going to vary based on the general design profile of the vehicle. It appears that the GV60 is a little bit less aerodynamically efficient, probably because this portion of the body does not pinch in as much as the EV6. This has a more compromised rear passenger compartment, but it has the longest range in the trio. Over 300 miles if you get the rear-wheel drive model, 274 in this all-wheel drive trim. This all-wheel drive model with way more performance comes down to 235 miles of range. And in case you're wondering, the Ioniq 5 does split the difference at 256 miles. I know a few people are offended by even this kind of platform sharing, but honestly, it makes a lot of sense for a luxury vehicle like this. When we take a look at low volume, relatively speaking, luxury car companies out there like Jaguar or Volvo or other car companies out there that aren't selling a corollary mainstream large volume electric vehicle, some of their vehicles come across as a little bit behind the times even when they're brand new. Both of these will do 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes. These are the two fastest charging vehicles in terms of time at that charger available in America right now. Significantly faster than the Volvo XC40, significantly faster than we're going to see in the upcoming Mercedes-Benz GLB as well. And that all has to do with the amount of research and development they were able to put in that communal pot of parts. Also, efficiency is excellent on both of these vehicles. Even though the EV6 is logically more efficient than the GV60, this still scores fairly well. It has a 77.4 kilowatt hour battery pack that will go 248 miles in the all-wheel drive version, 235 miles in the performance version, while also going 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds. So very, very fast times. Very realistic real-world range figures, and about 2.9 to 3 miles per kilowatt hour, which is pretty decent for a modern EV and definitely better than you'll find in a Volvo or likely that Mercedes-Benz GLB as well. Technically, the cargo area is a little bit bigger in the Kia EV6. Over here you can see that we have the child seats that we currently use for child seat testing, but the big difference between these cargo areas is probably more the shape of the opening. They're both a little on the triangular shape. You can see right there that hatch profile, but this sort of bottom corner in the EV6, the extra space that we get is really just about this towards the end, which is not overly useful. And then over here in the GV60, we have a bit more of a square cargo area, and that's why I was able to fit the same number of 24-inch roller bags in both of these vehicles. The total for both vehicles came in at 4. Under the floor, we find extra storage in both vehicles. But you'll notice that in the Kia, under the floor, we have hard plastics. And that's because there is a great deal more sound deadening going on in the GV60. You'll really notice that out on the road, that everything feels just a little bit more solid and a little bit quieter. Putting power to the ground on both of these vehicles, we have 255 width tires, 21-inch wheels and tires over there in the GV60, 20-inch wheels over here in the EV6, and different tires. These are Continental Cross Contact, and these are Michelin Primacy Tour tires, which are just a little bit more expensive. I have to say, I wish the GV60 had summer tires. You can see this little interesting kink there in that chrome styling bit. Over here on the back door, this is actually not part of the pillar, but part of the back door, we have a facial recognition camera that allows you to just look at the car and get in. We also find a lot of unique components inside the GV60. Really nothing in here is shared with the EV6. We have a more premium faux suede headliner. This has a large panoramic moonroof rather than the small one that we find in the EV6, but this does not open. 4-way adjustable headrests, height adjustable shoulder belts, Napa leather with a little sort of imitation suede accessory right there on top, contrasting stitching, very unique styling to the interior. This kind of reminds me maybe of a little bit of Mini, a little bit of Hyundai Nexo, and a whole lot of the rest of the Genesis lineup. We have a drawer-style glove compartment in the dash. I was able to fit a 15-inch tablet computer in there. Lots of stitched materials here. We have an actual stitched upper section of the dashboard, lots of soft touch materials all the way up and down the interior, including the bottom part of the door where we normally find hard plastics in mainstream vehicles. And then we find very similar software with different skins and different themes here for the Genesis. Same sort of dual 12.3-inch LCD cluster, but the rest of the dashboard is unique. Not even the steering wheel is common between the two. We find a touchscreen for the dual zone climate controls right here, EV start stop button there, unique buttons and switches and things like that, USB-C ports down there, a control wheel for the infotainment system, because apparently every luxury car must have a control wheel, and then a little bit of extra theater with this shift knob. If I turn the car on and off, you can see it rotates around like that to reveal or hide the actual shifter mechanism. Behind the shifter, we have some physical buttons for the heated and ventilated seats, auto brake hold, heated steering wheel, etc. Then we have a center console with a padded lid, small storage cubby right there, and Qi wireless charging mat that's fairly shallow because the entire portion of this console is open. You can see down there that we have two floor mats. One, the passenger side floor mat actually kind of extends over here to the driver's side, so you can just reach across there. The under console storage area is a little bit tricky to show you, but we have a little net over here, and then you're actually seeing that net way up front. It's basically a big tunnel all the way from the front to the rear. The steering wheel is a unique two-spoke design. It feels slightly narrower than the EV6's steering wheel. It doesn't have the flat bottom that I have on mine. The boost button over here gives you access to that nearly 500 horsepower. Drive mode button over there on that side, some programmable buttons on either side, and then this little sort of fingerprint sensor over here. It's not authentication, but it's a touch wheel like we found on old Blackberries. It allows you to navigate around that instrument cluster screen. Over here on this side, again, more unique buttons and switches and knobs. The window switches, they're not shared with anything else. And the door handles and things like that, those are unique to the GV60. You won't find those in any other Genesis either. Also not currently shared with anything, the Bang & Olufsen sound system is standard in the GV60. The driver's seat is also unique unique and a bit more comfortable. We have a power extending thigh cushion. You can adjust the curvature of the seat bottom cushion with this control by going up down. We have inflatable side bolsters, massage, a relax mode with that little toggle right there, and 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Moving over to the EV6, we definitely find less expensive components. We find a fabric headliner, plastic injection molded sun visors right there. We do have a small sunroof that opens, however. So if you want an opening sunroof, you'll find it here. You won't find it in the GV60, but it does cut down on front seat headroom. So if you choose that option in the EV6, you'll get about 2 inches less than you would in the Kia without that particular option. In this particular vehicle, we have imitation leather there rather than real leather like you find in the Genesis, and the center portion of the seat is all that imitation suede fabric. That is an option on the EV6. Moving over to the front doors, we find more hard plastics than we find in the GV60. The entire lower portion of that door is a hard plastic, although the upper section is soft. Also more hard plastics on the dashboard, slightly smaller glove compartment here, lots of ambient lighting strips, and definitely a very modern design. You can see it in the texture of that dashboard component, the texture of these center components as well, but no stitched components on the upper section of the dashboard, and hard plastics up here as well, rather than the stitched components that we found in the GV60. We still have a large heads-up display, basically the same one that's in that Genesis, and the same sort of two-screen setup right here in the dashboard, although the software has been tweaked to give it more of a Kia vibe. Down here, they went button minimalist, which probably saved some money, but this is my least favorite feature inside. These controls double as infotainment controls and climate controls, so you have to click that little toggle if you want to change between the two. That's not overly intuitive. We have touch buttons for the heated and ventilated seats right here. In this particular trim, they're physical buttons depending on the trim that you get. Power button gets relocated there. Rotary shifter, it doesn't do anything fancy or descend in there, it just rotates around. Parking sensors, a bit more of a traditional center console. There's a bin down there, and then this floating sort of diving board section up here. Qi wireless charging mat, 2 big cup holders, and then a slightly larger center console storage area because there is no storage usable right there under that. The steering wheel in the EV6 is decidedly modern. We have the new Kia logo right there in the middle. The same paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel that we find in the GV60, or I should say regen paddles because they're not shifting anything. If you click this one on the left side, it increases the throttle liftoff regen. The one on the right side decreases it. We have infotainment buttons over here, fewer programmable buttons generally speaking in this vehicle, and then over here we have controls for the standard radar adaptive cruise control, and then just a drive mode button down here, no boost mode. The controls in here are unique to the EV6 at the moment, but these are probably going to find their way into other Kias over time, and you will see things like this new little climate control screen. That's going to work its way into other Kia models. We've already seen that in the new Sportage, for instance. The driver's seat in the EV6 is much less adjustable. You can see we just have a 2-way lumbar support there, none of the extra features and functions that we find in the Genesis. On the other hand, the Kia has a more generous back seat. You'll certainly notice the difference in terms of legroom, although headroom is fairly similar between the two vehicles. Some extra cup holders, there's some in the center console and some on the doors, heated rear seats also, and buttons for locking and unlocking the doors on the rear door, and auto up-down windows for all 4 positions. If you're slumming it in the Kia, we don't have the window shades. We have the heated rear seats, but we don't have auto up and auto down windows. Out on the road, the Genesis GV60 is a bit more differentiated from the EV6 than the EV6 is from the Ioniq 5, although the electric motors and the batteries, again, are very, very similar, as are the tire sizes on all 3 of these vehicles. So it's no wonder that acceleration, braking distances, and general skid pad scores are pretty similar, the 3 vehicles, one from the other. Now, where the GV60 is a little bit different is in its curb weight. It is heavier because we have extra sound deadening in here. So even though this is the smallest of the trio, it actually manages to be the heaviest, especially if we're talking about the performance version, because it has the bigger and more powerful and logically heavier electric motor up front. Now, that bigger electric motor makes a big difference in the way the GV60 feels. In regular sport mode, this is just a little bit faster than the EV6 or the Ioniq 5 will ever be at the moment. But if you press the boost button, things go into crazy overload mode, and you go 3.8 seconds 0 to 60 with lots of wheel spin. I suspect that all of your performance numbers would improve, including acceleration, if you put summer tires on the GV60. The first part of wheel spin happens at the launch because the rear tires are just spinning a little bit back there. There is a limited slip differential in this performance model that we don't have in the others, which really helps improve that grip. The next bout of wheel slip happens around 20 to 30 miles an hour when full power happens on the front electric motor. Genesis deliberately delays full power on the front motor in order to help get the vehicle launched, keep it from having strange torque steer and other weird feelings up front. But then when that front motor comes fully on the boil, you will notice you'll get a little bit of wheel slip up front, especially if you're on a less than perfect surface. things start to get a little bit different between these three vehicles when we start talking about handling and ride quality. This GV60 has the adaptive suspension system on it. It's standard on the performance trim. But this is not the same kind of performance package that you might find on a BMW or a Mercedes, because this suspension is always tuned towards the softer side of things. Now, I find that refreshing, but if you were expecting the GV60 performance to be sort of a BMW M product or a Mercedes AMG, then you're probably going to be disappointed. The interesting twist here is that even though I generally like adaptive suspension systems, I prefer the non-adaptive suspension system currently in the EV6 over what we find in the GV60. This comes across a little bit uncoordinated at times in the amount of damping that we get versus the spring rate. It's always favoring the softer side of things. It feels a little bit more like some Lincolns with adaptive suspension systems rather than BMWs with adaptive suspension systems. So just keep that relative suspension tuning, I guess you could say, in mind. The other thing you're going to notice is how much quieter the GV60 is than the EV6. All the way around, you'll notice more expensive materials, thicker materials, more sound deadening. Even things like the slush molded plastics on the driver and passenger doors, the extra stitched parts on the dashboard, all of that helps isolate the cabin. Significantly more sound deadening back there in the rear of the vehicle. All that leads to this getting 69.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour. That is notably quieter than the Hyundai or the Kia, certainly in keeping with its luxury image. Now, when it comes to efficiency, the EV6 certainly wins with its more aerodynamic profile, especially if you're going to go on longer road trips. You'll really notice that in the Kia. It's not the best corollary, of course, because this has that larger, more powerful, and therefore less efficient electric motor up front, but you will certainly notice the difference in terms of relative efficiency. In this Genesis, I was averaging about 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour. In the EV6, if you treat things gently, you can eke it all the way up to about 3.8, 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour. And in eco mode, without too much effort, you can usually get 3.5 to 3.6 miles per kilowatt hour. Definitely more efficient than the Genesis. If you're looking for the most bonkers option between these two, that is definitely going to be the GV60. This is insanely quick. In fact, it is so quick that I'm really forced to make the statement that the motors can write checks that the tires just can't cash. This is the kind of vehicle that really needs wider, grippier summer tires, optional or standard, one of the two, because that's what's going to be required to harness the kind of power that these motors can put out. Handling with the standard 255 with tires is excellent in its own right, but it would definitely go to the next level with summer tires. If you put summer tires on this, honestly, this has the performance and the grip to really hold its own against even some of the much more expensive electric cars that we find out there on the market. And remember, this still has its $7,500 tax credit, so certainly keep that in mind. If you're trying to decide between the EV6 and the GV60, you have a really tough job ahead of you. There's so much to like about both of these vehicles, and their price tags are closer than you might be thinking. I know at the beginning of the video I said the GV60 was a lot more expensive. I'm talking about this exact GV60. This is nearly $10,000 more expensive than this Kia EV6 right here. The tricky part is, comparably equipped, it's almost exactly the same price, because a top-end Kia EV6 is just under $60,000 and a bottom-end GV60 with standard all-wheel drive, standard heat pump, 314 horsepower, etc., that comes in, you guessed it, just under $60,000. Now, the warranty is pretty darn comparable between the two, but it is a little bit longer in some areas over here on the Genesis. Also a bit more comfortable on the inside with the snazzier stereo, some of the extra features that we find in the Genesis lineup. The tire size on those two vehicles ends up being pretty similar. 20-inch wheels are standard, still 255 with tires on both of them. In terms of interior dimensions, very similar. Although, depending on the angle, you'll notice the roofline is higher in the GV60, giving it more of an actual crossover profile. This roofline is lower, sleeker, sexier, more compromised in the back. Which vehicle is right for you is going to depend on how much you want the extra interior space that we find in the EV6 and the larger cargo area in the back. But you might need the extra headroom in the GV60 if you have taller folks in the back, so that makes that decision pretty tricky. Personally, I think the GV60 is where I would go, and I might even consider the performance trim, because this upgrade is definitely expensive, but this is a completely different level of bonkers than we find in a Kia that can go 0 to 60 in 4.2 to 4.4 seconds. This one doing it in 3.8 seconds with all that drama going on with wheels spinning, etc. That is just so much fun that the GV60 is an incredible deal. And even at this price, it is significantly less expensive than something like a Tesla Model Y, because this has a full $7,500 federal tax credit on it. And another important thing to keep in mind if you're watching this video later is that Kia has a separate federal tax pool from Genesis. So logically, the EV6 and other EVs from Kia are going to be selling in greater number. They're probably going to run out of their federal tax credit at some point in time, which means that at some point in time, the Kia may end up being less expensive than the Genesis over here. And that really will be an interesting twist when that happens, but it's logically going to happen in the next year or so. Let me know which of these vehicles is right for you. Which would you pick if you're cross-shopping between the two? There is so much to like about both of these, and of course the Ioniq 5, that it really is hard to choose. Fast DC charging, fast AC charging, high efficiency, practical and comfortable interiors. And although they have the same flaw when it comes to the infotainment system, hopefully that's something they can fix in the future. And for me, it hasn't been that big of a deal. I generally plan my DC fast charging trips myself, even in vehicles that do that planning for you. But that is one big thing to keep in mind. Neither of these vehicles will really direct you to DC fast charging. They will tell you that you can't make it to your destination without it. They just won't really help you do much about it in that process. Be sure and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Find me over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those other social places. We'll see everybody next week.